Well, I think the birthday party, everyone was just doing anything they wanted to, and it was sort of like an explosion, a controlled explosion, which was, riveting to watch and to listen to. The birthday party albums are incredible. But with the Bad Seeds, I think they introduced more elements to it.
The punk scene in Melbourne and particularly the birthday party were antithetical to everything else at that time.
For us, punk was something that allowed you to break the rules, which was what we were interested in doing.
Well, punk had become a limited format, and people really needed to move on from that and experiment. And I think that the Boys Next Door and Birthday Party really, for some people, paved the way.
I mean, they were, in a certain scene, they were like kind of these giants, these titans, and they'd come back and they just seemed like they'd even grown bigger in the time that they were away, and like, God, what are they going to do this time, and what are they going to look like, that sort of thing, and what are they going to sound like?
There wasn't really a scene with enough papers and people and labels to really do anything, whereas there was in London.
Then they made that move, and then they stayed overseas, and it really kind of it set the bar, I think, for a lot of people who maybe aspired to make music or be creative. It really set some kind of bar. It was like, right, is that how you do it?
I think they had heard a few records, like the pop group Years Beyond Good and Evil, and various other things that kind of convinced them that England was the place to be. It was like seething with this sort of wild, primal energy. But by the time they got here, it had moved on to this sort of more pop-oriented phase and I guess a more sort of controlled aesthetic.
You started wondering about yourself. You went all the way across the world because you were interested in music. And there was nothing there that excited you, virtually. I mean, when the birthday party went, the pop group was still going, and they got to see them. But I never saw anything that I liked until I saw the birthday party, and then saw the Clowns.
Years and years ago, I was in this little club in Reissue in Essex called Crocs, and we were attacked by I was in the audience, and we were attacked by the birthday party.
I went to see the last birthday party concert at the Electric Ballroom, which was quite a sad affair, in 1983, and almost thought, this is it, this is the end.
Towards the end, the head-on collision between band members and the audience was something else. I don't think there's been anything since.
The transition was very quick. I mean, I was still taking photos for Mutiny when he was recording the first side of From Her to Eternity.
The birthday party was very much a group, and it had the players that it had in it, which were Tracy Pugh, obviously, who had a very particular bass style, and Roland Howard, who had a very particular guitar style. And there was quite a specific sonic intention with that group, and it was something I think Nick had enough of.
As much as I loved the birthday party, the Bad Seeds actually had a level of direction to it. It wasn't as much of it was a different type of assault. There's the assault of the birthday party, which is just a sort of sonic. It has a level of Einstürzen Neubauten to it. Whereas with Bad Seeds, it was, well, let me put it this way. The birthday party was like carpet bombing, whereas the Bad Seeds was more like smart bombs. It was directed, and there was a precision to the songs themselves.
When I joined the Bad Seeds or started playing with them in the first place, the idea of that band was not that it was going to be a fixed group in the way that the birthday party had been. That was self-evident because involved in the group were people who were key figures in other bands.
It would have been Mick Harvey on drums, Barry Adamson from Magazine on bass, Hugo Race on guitar, Nick and
Blitzer Bargeld from Einstürzende Neubauten as well on guitar and backing vocals. So it was this. It wasn't a normal band. It was total perfection of, and probably the likes will never ever be seen again. I don't think. And it just seemed like a collision of incredibly interesting people from what some people might describe as avant-garde or sort of noise or whatever. But it was, for me, it was Elvis Presley meets Johnny Cash meets the Sex Pistols with better lyrics and more poetry than probably a 19-year-old with half a gram of speed in his head could ever imagine.
Somebody said, "Oh, do you want to go and see Nick Cave play? He's playing solo." So of course I thought, well, that sounds great. We ended up going to a place called Surbiton, which is a really nowhere North London, South London suburb. We got there way too early.
I'd seen the Bad Seeds walking around in Surbiton High Street during the day. I think to this day they don't know what they were doing there. And they were playing in the very hall where my sister used to do her ballet, modern and tap classes.
And at the time in the tickets it said Nick Cave and the Cavemen. And I was kind of hoping that maybe he was going to extend the birthday party kind of garage band sensibilities and become just a total trash outfit. But in the end we got there and he'd renamed the band on the posters. It was Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds.
He was walking in and out the crowd, quite deliberately prowling around to kind of psych everyone up and himself. And they began the set with Avalanche. And I mean, it was such a immediately visceral and engaging thing. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. I probably haven't seen anything like it since. I think it completely changed the way I felt about music, art and performance all in one.
He seemed to have moved within the sort of 6, 8, 10, 12 months between the end of the birthday party and the start of the Bad Seeds into a whole new kind of showman shtick that he was doing. And it wasn't as kind of violent.
To hear that sound, this brittle sort of sculpted noise. Avalanche, I didn't know Leonard Cohen. I was an impressionable dope-head teenager with maybe 2 Joy Division records. It was about as weird as I'd ever got. That was phenomenal.
The Bad Seeds seemed to be a completely different thing to the birthday party. It was like they were like a show band in a way, in a good way.
I think the whole change into the early Bad Seeds sound was more just accidental and just him trying to find what kind of music he wanted to do, which he wasn't really sure about yet, I don't think. So he was just feeling his way, and we were all feeling our way.
You know, Nick wanted to be aligned with certain things, and I think he had an instinctive approach to the way he would build things for himself from there on in. So, you know, covering Leonard Cohen may not have been, in inverted commas, fashionable, but it was certainly, you know, flying a flag.
Track 1, it's a cover. It's your first solo record, so it's a bold statement. He's doing a cover, an interpretation of a Leonard Cohen song, and a song which I think can be interpreted as a direct address to the fans of the birthday party who had sort of destroyed the group in a way.
It was like a fuck you almost to the people who had bought the record. Like, you think you know what I'm going to do and I'm going to go this way, and at the same time it's going another way.
The fact that he covered a Leonard Cohen song on his first album, I've said this for years, which is that you cannot judge a book by its cover, but you can judge a band by its cover.
It's so evil for the very first song of the album. It's completely transportative.
We'd been playing it for some months before we taped it. It was a regular part of the live shows with Man or Myth or the Cavemen or the Bad Seeds or whatever they were called at that time. It was a point in live performance where Nick could really go first person with the audience because it's very stripped back.
It was so stark and just so immediate and so engaging. That was the first time I saw them.
I think From Her to Eternity really sort of consumed me when I first heard it. And I don't know when that is, but the cover of From Her to Eternity is so incredible.
Yeah, it's just ill, and it suits the music perfectly, and it made my dad hate him even more.
I remember what immediately happened after that. My friend had I think my mates, some thespian friends. You know, I grew up surrounded by much better off friends who would have games rooms and the such. And I went back to a party with one of my friends where they all seemed to be practicing being gay just for a laugh. It was all very David Bowie. Maybe some of them were. And I can remember at the end of that night, literally standing in the room, surrounded by groping people, with the cover of From Her to Eternity in all its lurid pink and monochrome beauty throbbing up at me, while Avalanche, you know, back to the beginning of side one on the old record players continuously, just me listening to that song, you know, feeling the pain of every word. Of course, I didn't know a damn thing.
Avalanche ends, and then comes the full sonic onslaught of Cabin Fever.
That was finished on the last night of making the record, and they'd recorded it twice beforehand and scrapped it, and there was just a drum track, I think, and we started work at about 11 o'clock at night, and we had to work through, and we had to finish at 10 o'clock in the morning, and that's like record it, mix it, put the album together and walk out of the studio. And it seemed like a very, very tall order. And there was a lot of friction and a lot of other things going on. And it led to a lot of fractious behaviour that night, to the point it must have been about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. Nick basically was thrown out of the studio. And I was going, well, how are we going to finish doing this? And we managed to do it, and then Nick re-arrived at about 9:30, professing his love for everybody, and it all got done. But in a way, that is the embodiment of like how a track actually comes out of exactly what it's describing. I mean, it was total Cabin Fever.
You got the Well of Misery on there, where you have this really slow boom, drumming all the way through it, and it's just this beautiful slow. I mean, and it wasn't what you expected.
What I really liked about it was this sort of sudden space that was in there, and this kind of lack of filling, and it just really kind of pulsing, and then just this sort of, you know, sort of vomiting of words over the top of it.
I used to love that that cod gospel chain gang prison chant of it. And I thought the lyrics were hilarious.
It kind of suited the times in London. I mean, the early 80s in London was quite a strange place to be, and there was a big squat scene, and it was, if you ever got hold of any money, it was always kind of like, do we spend it on beer? Do we spend it on bread? You know, and it was a crazy place to be, and an incredibly exciting place to be, and I kind of miss it in a way, and it was a sort of music that made such an impact on me. I had to go to Berlin and sort of find out where elements of it was coming from.
You know, it was like a completely different city, Berlin, back then than today. The scene of Berlin was a little group of people and a small band of people, you know, and I always had the impression that everybody kind of played with everybody else in each band. It wasn't, you know, there was these bands, but everyone was playing together for some reason. Because like Thomas Wiedler was the band that I was playing in. He was our drummer, and then we got a drum machine, and he ended up playing with Die Haut.
Two friends of mine made a tour management in Berlin, and they just organized that tour with the birthday party, and they were friends of mine. And so they then they asked us of Die Haut, we want to support them.
I was doing the sound for Die Haut, and Elizabeth was doing the lights.
And we went to big places, yeah, in just big cities, and it was crowded all the time, and I was in a good mood. I just drove the car, and we made the concerts, and I was only involved in my thing to do with my band.
From the record we had heard, we had a totally different impression, or had imagined them to be totally different than they actually were. When like Tracy Pugh came with this cowboy hat and they all had cowboy boots on and stuff like that, and that was a total surprise.
We were a strange, loud instrumental band, so the both bands together on one evening was wonderful.
I was in the first row and I was standing there, and he just hit me with the music. All my sins and everything, my whole feelings, and I just thought by myself, what a guy, what is he doing on stage? I thought he is just breaking all his bones.
There was such an electricity, energy that, has stayed with me to today, because I've never seen a band like that, actually.
We knew that we had met some very like-minded people, surprisingly enough, from the other corner of the world.
And having been with Nick on tour, it's like I kind of like talks about how fantastic I thought Berlin was, and how you could go to the Intershop, which was a shop in the middle of East Berlin on the western side of the platform of the railway, the underground station, where you could buy duty-free liquor and cigarettes, and this kind of seemed to be quite attractive to the band, that you could get a bottle of vodka for like, £2 or something. And one day Nick just turned up on my doorstep. It's like, oh, okay. And he stayed in my flat then for a while.
My feeling is that if you're in a place like Berlin, which has its very own special creative center, you can distance yourself from the rest of the world of music and be more original and make your own thing more easily.
And I remember when Nick came to my flat, I had this this quite big, very basic, concrete flat loft, you would maybe say, in Kreuzberg, which was quite spacious. And I remember the total excitement of Nick and the others, coming from London.
I mean, Berlin was at that time a place where, you like to go to extremes, and they were here too. So we all kind of followed that rule.
It was a great time of experiment and research, and we would basically very much put our respective health on the line.
I took Nick right away to a studio next door, basically from where I lived. And Einstürzende Neubauten were just recording at this moment, and they record them in this situation where they were just recording beats, beating on a half pig.
We were not only beating dead meat, we were also hitting each other, wearing contact mics on our body and doing stuff like that.
There was emotional and physical intensity.
Blixa had a large influence on the development of these songs, particularly sonically.
I think a song like Well of Misery is kind of a turning point song in being a Bad Seed song that wouldn't have been a birthday party song.
It wasn't kind of an amazing maturity. It was more a question of, somebody passing from teenage into a kind of a rather more serious area.
When I very first met Nick, before I got to know him at all, I went to a party with him and Lydia, and he was talking to somebody, and I overheard him say, I want to write really sad songs, the kind of sad, like taking somebody's little finger and breaking it in 3 places. That really stuck with me.
He built up a huge sense of his own mythology, and he was sort of becoming aware of that possibility towards the end of the birthday party, that he could say things and in interviews, and the point wasn't whether they were true or not. The point was what they revealed about him?
When I think of like the emergence of what the Bad Seeds were versus the birthday party, was that we were fully coming into a kind of postmodernist condition, and that's why you can get so many covers, and you can get so many coded musical references. Is that punk still was out of the modernist impulse, and it still believed that we could rip it apart and rebuild it again.
I somehow fell into being a tour manager, and I tour managed. My sort of first exercising in tour managing was accompanying Nick and Lydia Lunch and Mark Almond and Jim Thirlwell to America for a tour, which was called the Immaculate Consumptive.
It was a sort of a failed experiment that was utterly brilliant.
I don't know how many people actually saw it, but yeah, it was definitely an interesting thing and pivotal for me, because that started my love affair from New York. When I came here to do those shows, I never went back.
They kind of did it as this almost Weimar era kind of cabaret.
Each show concluded with Nick playing a version of A Box for Black Paul. Although each time he played it, he never finished it.
He had to follow Jim Fetus, who had done some show and wrecked the piano. So Nick sat down at the piano and he couldn't play it because it was too wrecked. And then the next night he did manage to play it, but he'd been fighting with Jim and Lydia that day and he was in a bad mood. So he did a few bars of it and then he said, and it goes on like this for another 10 minutes, and just walked off the stage. And he would also do In the Ghetto at the end of each show. He did a fantastic version of In the Ghetto, which just kind of blew everyone off their feet.
It was, especially in the context of kind of Lydia's sexed up rage or Mark Almond's kind of willful decadence, it seemed camp. That was the only way we could read it at the time. But the rub is that Nick had tears rolling down his cheeks as he's singing In the Ghetto. And this is not even a Lieber Stoller Presley tune. This is like Mac Davis. This is like not even great Elvis. This is like, when he returns back to the studio in 1969 after his 68 comeback, which, maybe has been laudatory historically afterwards. But, for anyone who'd already been turned on to real rock and roll since then, or at least, Britain's version of it, it was, redundant and kind of pathetic. And yet he vested so much into this song. And of course it wasn't camp.
I remember thinking, well, this is interesting. Is Nick going to become, like the crooner of our generation or the Elvis of our generation? Because he also liked Scott Walker and, it seemed to be that he was a good ballad singer.
In the Ghetto, what he did there was he took something really maudlin and kind of mawkish and made it transcendent.
It's by far the greatest version of that track ever recorded, because everyone else has recorded it like it's some sort of Hollywood ghetto, where everyone only has 3 cars and 2 houses. Elvis's version of it doesn't necessarily make you think that it's that sinister, and Nick Cave's version of it is very sinister.
It was kind of a dangerous place to be going to gigs in those days, and there was a good chance you would come away with, a sort of bleeding or, a lost limb or maybe a lost shoe or something. It wasn't, it was a sort of, it was a crazy place to be at the front of a Nick Cave gig back then. And you kind of had to fight for your spot as you just get pushed to the side. So the feeling was one of incredible sort of excitement, enormous sort of expectation about what was going to happen, and knowing every single word of every single song of what was about to take place just made me feel that I was in exactly the place where I wanted to be at that particular time.
As anybody who's ever seen Nick Cave knows, as a performer, there's no point of comparison. I'm not the starstruck 16-year-old I once was. I'm just speaking realistically when I say the amount of game that he brings to the live arena is something that every other performer should study.
We split a sort of grammar speed into 2 pints of cider and black, and I made my way to the front of the crowd and hung on to the stage until they came on, and stayed there pretty much for the whole show, which was a really cathartic experience for me. I was planning to go to drama school, of all things, but by the end of the show, my mind had been twisted around to wanting to surround myself with bands like Nick Cave, and particularly probably live music.
I think pretty much the brief was how loud I could get it. And, Nick would always sort of, after the show, was it loud enough, Victor? Or, if someone was walking backstage, they would just, Nick would, if they said, oh, that sounded good, he'd just go, is it loud? Was it loud enough?
I pushed my way into a dressing room and met the object of my desire and asked him if I could possibly have like a set list or something. And at the time, my favourite song on the album was the title track, From Her to Eternity. And he ended up giving me this, which was the lyrics that he sang from on the stage on that gig here, which I sort of almost burst into tears and ran onto the bus with, and various goths offered me sort of £50 for, which at the time would have been a fine thing and probably food for 3 weeks, but I kept hold of it, and it's my most treasured possession from any gig that I've ever been to.
From Her to Eternity that's the song. I love it when he plays live. It's such a, there's so much going on in that song. It's so simple, and it's such a carnal song. It's just got all that raw emotion, and yeah, when he plays that live, you just want to go and take every girl home.
That song, I think, is I haven't listened to it for a long time, but it just seems like every time you listen to it, you hear something new in it.
There's a part of that record when Nick goes, I read her diary on her sheets, and the band just sort of explodes, and then plus there's a wonderful like film, if you like, theme that's repeated that Mick Harvey played, and where Blix is doing it, and I'm trying to hold the thing together.
It just sounds extraordinary. It's got this sort of beautiful sort of melodrama. It's almost like if Elvis Presley had took smack and was hanging out with Phil Spector. It's got that feeling of complete angst, complete sort of not with itself, but knowing itself.
It just sort of just makes you so sexually excited.
You know what? That song From Her to Eternity reminds me of The Rite of Spring. Because I took ballet for many, many years, and I had I'm such a dork. I had a Stravinsky record that had the Firebird and the Rite of Spring on it, and I used to listen to it, and I would get scared. I was alone in my parents' house once listening to the Rite of Spring, and I was so scared I had to turn it off. But that song I just realized reminds me of the Rite of Spring, because I remember that low sort of marching, like primitive tribal dun 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 dun.
Like solid beat that kind of reminds me of like an early Suicide record or something, and it's just pulsing, it's tense, but then there's a release, it almost reminds me of like cinematic horror music at times.
How on earth did someone imagine this story of the girl weeping and crying through the floor and the tears falling on this guy's face? Or it's astounding in the way that there's something very cinematic about it. I mean, it sort of astounds me in the same way that watching Night of the Hunter or a movie like that.
It's like his writing and the kind of thing I got from the visual imagery I got off his stuff, man. It was like kind of like his whole, it's hard to describe. It's another world, man.
I think it was like Nick was learning a new language to a certain extent. And, Mick Harvey helped to give him the freedom to learn that new language. And Mute provided a kind of vehicle stroke safety net to say, go ahead, do what you need to do.
Well, they needed a kind of a support system, a platform, I suppose, or something to work from. I mean, Mick Harvey was the one who was very organized. He was the kind of manager, to all intents and purposes, he was as close to a manager as they've ever had, but they needed to know that certain things, whatever happened, certain things would happen. We would organize, there would be a studio for them to record in. There would be a pressing plant, pressing their records. We just did the things that a record company does.
I'm not sure that some other labels would have been so patient with us to allow us to to believe in the music. I mean, Daniel Miller sort of believes in the music, and that, and he'll stick by you. And
I felt for Daniel at times. There were times, not only with Nick and the Bad Seeds, but with other acts that Daniel has signed, artists, where people wouldn't have survived without his understanding of what it is to be an artist.
And I remember Chris Carr saying to me, almost like, I don't know what he was trying, it's almost like warning me or something, said, Daniel, they are going to be going to a much longer, more narrative style. I said, fine, that sounds fantastic to me. And the stories that come out, very carefully worked out.
I believe the first day of the From Her to Eternity recording sessions, it was Nick, Barry, and me. And I think on the very first day we recorded Saint Huck.
It's like you're reading Huckleberry Finn, listening to the songs. It just goes on and on, building images up upon images. And I mean, obviously at this point, I guess he was in the early stages of developing, his novel, and I think at that time it was a film script.
And that's the thing I was interested in, really. It was almost creating these images through the music to enhance what the imagery. Not that it needed bloody enhancing, because it was pretty potent anyway, as it stood.
I love very much the very monotone pieces that are more like sort of theater pieces in a way.
I did set up a kind of a guitar installation. I mean, I was leaning the guitar against the amp, and I put a custom-made box in between that would cut off the signal on and off in particular intervals. And so once it was on, it would create a particular type of feedback that was delayed in a particular thing. That is something that if you listen to Saint Huck, you hear this kind of like, and then a little flute solo, what sounds like a flute. That is that guitar installation.
It was quite unlike anything I'd ever done before. There was no producer. There was just the band and myself.
I'd start playing something that could possibly belong in a Chic record, and but then taken out of context and put back into context, almost in a sort of using it subversely, if you like. It kind of started to take on a life of its own.
The next day, Mick Harvey came and played percussion, but because there was no drum set in there, he played just the flight cases from percussion instrument. He played all these like dark cardboard boxes of drums, which sounds great. I think there was one cymbal on a cymbal stand or a hi-hat, something. He played that, and that was good. That was really good.
We didn't go in and record as a band, which is something we'd always done in the birthday party. We'd always worked as a band, and the material was primarily, on 90% of the time, prepared in a live setting, and we'd already been playing the songs. And in the situation that surrounded From Her to Eternity, it was very much a studio album, which was built one bit at a time.
The other song on that album that I love is Wings Off Flies, and it's particularly appealed to my my self-conscious and self-obsessed teenager side of me.
When you have that kind of bedroom existence as a teenager, and you do you feel like an outsider, or you don't relate to people or whatever, you don't like mass social events, but you have a sense of kind of a disenfranchised community, and on some sense that record had that, because you had people on that record like Thirlwell did some of the music, didn't he? James Thirlwell, Fetus, did some of the music.
After the dissolution of the birthday party, Nick was kind of deciding on what he wanted to do next, and asked me about maybe writing some songs together. And we actually, he had this idea for this song, Wings Off Flies, which he had started, I think, with this guy, Pierre Voltaire. And actually, round at Lydia's place, because she had a piano, we knocked out the music.
It's such a creepy interior monologue, and in fact, most of the characters in that album are trapped in some way, whether it be the cabin fever, the well of misery, From Her to Eternity, where he's trapped in this room trying to escape to the room above him, but again it's this kind of like insular little hell. And the box for Black Paul.
Who'll build a box for Black Paul? I'm inquiring on behalf of his soul. I'd be beholden to you all for a little information, just some kind of indication. Who will dig the hole?
A Box for Black Paul was kind of a really interesting song. One of these songs that Nick Cave does. It's kind of self-reflexive about being an artist.
Is it or isn't it about the end of the birthday party? I mean, obviously it's got all these images in the song, like about pen pushers and hacks who've come to get the facts, and there's this sense of whoever Black Paul is, his died. These people are coming to dig the dirt, and it's obviously a parallel with the collapse of the birthday party.
For me, that was the highlight of the gig at Brixton, because you've got all these people wanting the birthday party. They got Mutiny, which for me, that was the first Bad Seeds track, because Blixer was on it. But apart from that, they got 10 minutes of Box for Black Paul, just Nick and a piano.
And they had this like cranky old wooden piano on the side of the stage. Mick Harvey starts playing it, and they do Box for Black Paul. This is his first solo tour on stage at the Pavilion Theatre in Brighton. And he just opens with this song, and he did the whole thing, and it was slower than on the record. It must have taken like 12 minutes to get through this song.
Not I, said the widow, adjusting her veil. I will not drive the nail or cart his puppet body home, for I done that 1,000 times before. Yeah, I done that 1,000 times or more, and why should I dress his wounds when he has wounded my dress nightly right across the floor?
And he did, got to the end of the song, and he says, and he said it numerous times since, but the concert will start now. So it was like, was it for him? Was it for us? And there's this great sense of drawing out this experience of this song, and people who really got it and just loved it, or they were going mad and wanting to jump up and down. And it was an amazing moment, because it was that sense of not just music, not just literature, but also kind of performativity of how you're going to perform a song, how one engages literally with the question of performing a song. And I think that was really interesting.
Well, I have cried 1,000 tears, and I have cried 1,000 tears, it's true. And the next stormy night, you know that I'm still crying them for you. Well, I had a girl, she was so sweet, red dress and long red hair hanging down, and heaven just ain't heaven without that little girl hanging round. Well, you know I've been a bad man, and Lord knows I've done some good things too. But I confess, my soul will never rest until you build a box for my girl too. How is a 16-year-old who likes dark things going to resist that,
I just imagine Nick watching this going, fuck, what do you know? Stop telling me what I meant to do when I did it. But that's our job as fans, is to come up with our own reasons why he wrote this, said this, did that. Because we're also obsessed with ourselves. It's really about us.
I go where no man before me bothered to go, till the soles of my shoes are shot full of holes, and it's all downhill with a bullet. This rambling and roving is taking its course. I'm grazing with the dinosaurs and the dear old horses, and the city streets crack and a great hole forces me down. My soapbox, my pulpit, the theater seal, the silver star spangled, and the coins in my pocket go jingle.